It's one of the biggest what-ifs of WW2. What if the Nazis had respected the one piece of technology they thought was a joke? In 1940, American radar was a clumsy, almost useless toy. But the Germans' decision to laugh at it rather than fear it may have cost them the entire war. The cavity magnetron is famous for winning the war, but what about the radar before it? The story of that technology involves a fatal arrogance that changed history. In the grim early days of 1940, the world was holding its breath. Here in the United States, we were an ocean away from the fighting, but the shadows were lengthening. We were a nation protected by two vast oceans, and for generations, that had been enough. But a new kind of warfare was being born in the skies over Europe, a war of speed, of engines, and of shadows. And in that new war, our oceans suddenly felt terribly small. Our greatest vulnerability was the unknown. What was hiding in the fog off the coast of Maine? What was lurking beneath the waves off Virginia? Our eyes, our human eyes, were no longer good enough. We had an idea, of course. The British were already fighting for their lives in the Battle of Britain, and they had a secret weapon. A clumsy string of towers along their coast called Chain Home. It was a radar of a sort. It blasted out radio waves and listened for the faint echo. It was crude. It couldn't tell altitude very well, and it was easily fooled. But it gave them one priceless advantage: a few minutes of warning. Just enough time to get their Spitfires in the air. It was just enough to save them. Here in America, our military knew we needed the same advantage, so we built our own. One of our very first attempts was a machine called the SCR-268. It was a beast, a tangle of metal antennas, gears, and vacuum tubes mounted on a truck bed. It was designed to help aim anti-aircraft guns to find a bomber in the dark. But it had a problem, a big one. It was clumsy, it was terribly inaccurate, and it operated on a low, noisy frequency. It was, in many ways, a toy. It was a noble effort, but it wasn't a war winner. And this is where our story truly begins, because at the exact same time, Nazi Germany was not idle. German scientists, brilliant in their own right, had developed their own radar systems. They had the Freya for long-range warning and the Würzburg for directing their own anti-aircraft guns. And here is the crucial fact, the detail that changes everything. Their technology was, in that moment, arguably better. Their Würzburg radar operated at a much higher frequency, which meant it was more accurate and used a smaller, more practical antenna. They were, in 1939 and 1940, ahead of the game. This technical lead gave them something else, something far more dangerous than a piece of equipment. It gave them arrogance. In 1939, before the war had fully engulfed the world, the German military was invited on a tour of American military installations. It was a standard diplomatic gesture of the time, a bit of muscle flexing. The U.S. Army, proud of his new gadget, decided to demonstrate the SCR-268. They unveiled the massive, awkward machine. They showed the German attachés the raw, flickering pulse on the screen, the A-scope. The German officers watched, they listened politely, and then they scoffed. Some, according to the reports, barely concealed their laughter. When their official report was sent back to Berlin, the message was clear and fatal. The Americans are children. They are playing with clumsy toys. Their radar is primitive, years behind our own. It is no threat. That report, that single moment of hubris, set in motion a chain of events that would cost them everything. The German High Command, blinded by their own early success, filed the American radar threat under solved. They believed they knew everything they needed to know about Allied detection. They made a classic, timeless mistake. They judged the current state of a technology, not the rate of improvement. They saw the first draft and assumed the final book would be just as bad. They looked at a Model T and concluded, with absolute certainty, that the Americans would never figure out how to build a V8.
This arrogance infected every branch of the German military. Most importantly, it infected the U-boat command. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the brilliant and ruthless commander of the submarine fleet, was launching his wolf packs into the North Atlantic. His strategy was built on one single assumption: invisibility. He believed his U-boats, surfacing at night to recharge their batteries, were ghosts. They were untouchable. And for a time, he was right. The happy time, as the U-boat captains called it, began. From 1940 to 1942, our lifeline to Great Britain was being severed, one ship at a time. Hundreds of thousands of tons of food, of fuel, of steel, of men were sent to the bottom of the ocean. The United States was losing the war of logistics. Britain was slowly starving. And the German High Command, fat and happy with their Freya and Würzburg systems, did nothing to prepare for what was coming. They had scoffed, and they had stopped thinking. But back in England, a different conversation was happening. It was 1940, and Winston Churchill knew that chain home was not enough. He knew that the only way to survive was with American manufacturing. But he also knew he had to offer something in return. He needed a bargaining chip, something so valuable, so game-changing, that it would force America's hand. This led to one of the most secret and important missions of the entire war, the Tizard Mission. In September of 1940, a group of British scientists, led by Sir Henry Tizard, boarded a ship for a secret journey to Washington, D.C. They carried with them a locked black box. Inside that box was the entire portfolio of British military secrets. Jet engine designs, new explosives, and one small, strange-looking copper disc. It was called the No. 12 Cavity Magnetron. It was, in short, a miracle. It was a device that could generate high-frequency radio waves, microwaves, at a power level no one had ever thought possible. It was the key. The British were brilliant scientists, but they didn't have the factories to mass-produce it. We did. When the Tizard mission revealed the magnetron to American engineers at the new top-secret MIT radiation laboratory, the Rad Lab, it was like handing them a thunderbolt. The entire game changed. The clumsy, low-frequency radar that the Nazis had laughed at was now obsolete. The race for microwave radar was on, a technology that Germans didn't even know was possible. This brings us to our first reflection. We often hear these stories, and it's easy to think of them as simple tales of invention, but this is a story of perspective. Think about how many times in our own lives we might have dismissed something or someone because it didn't look impressive at first glance. We all read headlines, we see new ideas, and we make a quick judgment. It's human nature. But that 1939 demonstration is a chilling reminder of what happens when you let that judgment harden into dogma. The Germans had the data, but they drew the wrong conclusion. We spend a lot of time on this channel digging into those forgotten details, the human moments behind the history. If this is the kind of history you appreciate, the kind that goes beyond just the dates and names, then taking a single moment to click that subscribe button tells us we're on the right track. It truly helps us know what stories you want us to tell next. So, the MIT Rad Lab was born. This was a place of legends. Tucked away in Massachusetts, it became the single largest scientific undertaking of the war, bigger even than the Manhattan Project at the time. Young physicists, engineers, and thinkers were pulled from every corner of the country. They were told to forget everything they knew and to build the impossible. Their mission? Turn that British miracle device, the cavity magnetron, into a weapon of war, and to do it before the Axis did. They worked with a desperate urgency. They knew about the shipping losses in the Atlantic. They knew that every day they spent tinkering in a lab, hundreds of men were drowning in icy water. The pressure was immense, but the challenge was just as big. This new centimetric radar, operating at 10 centimeters, was a completely new frontier. The old rules didn't apply. Vacuum tubes burned out, wiring melted. It was a brutal process of trial and error. Meanwhile, the Germans were blissfully unaware. Their U-boats continued their reign of terror. Their confidence, built on that 1939 Scoff, was at an all-time high. They had in fact just improved their own situation. They had captured a British ASV radar set, an early airborne radar from a downed plane. They analyzed it, confirmed it was low frequency, and felt even more secure. They even built a simple detector for it, a little wooden box in their U-boats called the Metox receiver. When an Allied plane with this old radar got close, the Metox would buzz, and the U-boat would dive to safety. The cat-and-mouse game continued, but the Germans felt they still had the upper hand. This is the green section, the problem. The Allies have a new secret, the Magnetron, but it's not ready. The Germans have an answer to our old technology, and they are sinking ships faster than we can build them. The stakes are rising. The German arrogance is now costing us. The American public was reading the papers, seeing the losses. The pressure on Roosevelt on the military was unbearable. Something had to be done.
And then it was done. The first purple moment. The payoff. The MIT Rad Lab had a breakthrough. They managed to shrink the new powerful microwave radar set down to the size of a trash can. Small enough and light enough to be fitted into the belly of a B-24 Liberator or a British Sunderland flying boat. This new system was called H-2S, or ASV Mark III, by the Americans, and it changed the world overnight. In early 1943, these new Magnetron-equipped planes began patrolling the Bay of Biscay in the North Atlantic. A German U-boat surfaces at night. The captain is on the bridge, scanning the dark sky. The Metox receiver in the control room is silent. Why? Because the new Allied radar operated at a frequency so high, so completely different, that the Metox could not detect it. It was deaf. The U-boat crew felt completely safe. And then, out of the black, starless sky came death. The Allied plane, seeing a perfect bright blip on its new H-2S radar screen, would dive. In the final moments, the bombardier would flip a switch for another new invention, the Lee light, a massive, powerful searchlight. Suddenly, the U-boat was bathed in daylight. The German sailors, blinded and panicked, had no time to dive, no time to man their guns. Seconds later, the depth charges would hit. The ocean would boil, and another U-boat would be gone forever. The effect was not just immediate, it was devastating. The German U-boat fleet called this Black May of 1943. The losses were catastrophic. In 1 month, Dönitz lost over 40 submarines. Experienced captains, veteran crews, all vanished. The Wolfpacks were not just defeated, they were being annihilated. Admiral Dönitz, in a state of shock, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has rendered the U-boat ineffective. We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." And all of it, traces back to that one moment in 1939, that moment a German officer laughed at a clumsy American machine. That laugh was the sound of a fatal miscalculation. They assumed our technological growth would be slow, linear. They couldn't imagine in their rigid system an organization like the MIT Rad Lab, a place of chaotic, brilliant, funded by the government but run by civilians, speed. They couldn't imagine a nation once roused could leapfrog an entire generation of technology in less than 2 years.
Let's pause and really think about this what if. What if those officers in 1939 had been smarter? What if they hadn't scoffed? What if they had looked at the SCR-268 and thought, this is crude, but the idea is dangerous. The Americans are thinking about this. We must assume they will get better. What would have happened? Well, for one, they would have poured resources into their own microwave radar research, which they had started but abandoned. They might have tasked their intelligence services with one single goal: find out what the Americans and British are doing in their labs. They might have been prepared. They might have developed a detector for microwave radar before H2S was deployed. If they had done that, if the Metox receiver had been able to detect the new radar, the Battle of the Atlantic would have dragged on. 1943 would not have been Black May. It might have been another happy time. And if the U-boats had kept sinking ships at that rate, the buildup of men and material in England for the D-Day landings might never have happened. You cannot launch the largest amphibious invasion in history if you cannot control the seas. The entire shape of the war in Europe would have changed. But their arrogance wasn't just in the Atlantic. It had poisoned their thinking in the air war, too. The German High Command, particularly Hermann Göring, was resistant to defensive technologies. He was a fighter pilot, an ace from the First World War. He believed in the offense, in the pilot's skill. Radar was a crutch. So, because of this, German night fighter development stalled. They had amazing planes like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, but they were struggling to find the British bombers in the dark. They relied on ground-based Würzburg radar to talk their pilots toward the target. It was inefficient. The British bombers, meanwhile, were getting their own radar. First a tail warning radar, and then the same H2S system, which gave them a crude map of the ground below them, even through solid clouds. They could bomb German cities with an accuracy that was, for the time, terrifying. The Germans were completely baffled. How were the British bombing Berlin on a night with 10,000 feet of cloud cover? They assumed it was a complex system of radio beams. They flew their own planes around trying to find these beams. They captured downed British bombers and found the H2S sets, but their own scientists, still trapped in the low-frequency mindset, couldn't believe it was possible. They thought it was a deception. By the time they finally understood what the cavity magnetron was and what it did, it was 1944. It was too late. The Allied arsenal of democracy had produced tens of thousands of these radar sets. They were in every bomber, every patrol plane, every destroyer escort. The German war machine, which relied on its factories, was being systematically dismantled from the air night after night because they could no longer hide. The story of the pre-cavity tech, of that clumsy SCR-268, isn't really about the machine itself. The machine was, in fact, not very good. The story is about the reaction to it. The Nazi officers saw a piece of hardware and judged it. The American and British scientists saw a problem and became obsessed with solving it. This is a lesson that echoes far beyond the 1940s. It's about the danger of early success. Germany's early success with its own radar made them complacent. It closed their minds. America's early failure with radar made us desperate, and that desperation made us open to radical new ideas, like the one Tizard brought over in his black box. It's fascinating how this one seemingly small technological thread runs through the entire war. We've talked a lot about the Battle of the Atlantic, but think about the Pacific. The very first radar sets we had, the SCR-270, a cousin of the 268, were the ones installed at Pearl Harbor. And on the morning of December 7th, 1941, two privates practicing with the new, confusing machine saw a massive blob on their screen, the largest they had ever seen. They reported it. But the officer on duty, new to the job, made a fatal assumption. He told them it was probably a flight of B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive from the mainland. He told them, "Don't worry about it." That blob, of course, was the first wave of the Japanese attack. The technology worked. But the human system around the technology, the belief in it, was not there yet. The arrogance of the Germans was loud and boastful. Our own in that moment was quiet. It was the arrogance of "that can't be right."
It took the shock of Pearl Harbor to make us believe. It took the loss of thousands of lives to make us finally understand that this clumsy toy was the key to survival. From that moment on, the U.S. never scoffed at radar again. We poured, by the end of the war, billions of dollars into the MIT Rad Lab. We put radar on ships to find other ships. We put it on planes to find planes. We put it in artillery shells, the VT fuse, so they would explode when they got near a target, not just when they hit it. And the Germans? They were perpetually one step behind. They were reacting, not innovating. When their U-boats were being sunk by planes they couldn't see, they reacted by putting more anti-aircraft guns on the decks. A terrible decision. It made the U-boats slow, and they couldn't dive as fast. They were sitting ducks. They reacted to the H-2S radar by developing the Naxos detector, but by the time it was deployed, the war was all but lost. It's a story of mindset. The German military mindset was, this is what we have, it is good, it is superior. The Allied mindset, forged in desperation, was, this is not good enough. What's next? That, right there, is the difference between victory and defeat. It wasn't just about steel or oil or even the number of men. It was about the willingness to be wrong. The willingness to admit that your first try, your SCR-268, was a piece of junk, but that the idea was worth pursuing to the ends of the earth. We get a lot of comments on these videos from men who worked with early versions of this technology, maybe in the 50s or 60s in the Cold War. And many of you have shared your own stories of seeing a new piece of gear and wondering how on earth it would ever work. We read those comments, and they inspired this very deep dive. It's a reminder that history isn't just something in books, it's something many of you lived. We'd be honored if you'd let us know in the comments what other forgotten tech stories from that era we should cover next. Your insights are truly a huge part of what makes this community special. Let's dig even deeper into this. Let's talk about the people. When the Germans scoffed, they were scoffing at men like Dr. Alfred Loomis, a secretive Wall Street millionaire who had his own private laboratory and was already funding radar research with his own money before the government even took it seriously. They were scoffing at Vannevar Bush, the man who convinced President Roosevelt that the next war would be won by scientists, not just soldiers. They were scoffing at the thousands of young, brilliant 20-something physicists at the MIT Rad Lab who gave up their academic careers to work 100-hour weeks in secret. The German system, for all its vaunted efficiency, was rigid. It was terrified of failure. Hitler famously distrusted any defensive science and at one point declared that no new research project could be funded unless it could guarantee a result within 6 months. That's a death sentence for real innovation. You can't invent the cavity magnetron on a 6-month deadline. The American system, by contrast, was messy. It was chaotic. It was a tangle of civilian labs, military contracts, and private industry all competing and cooperating at the same time. And it was because it was messy that it was so fast. The Rad Lab had a motto: no rank. A good idea could come from a Nobel Prize winner or a 22-year-old graduate student, and it was treated with the same respect. So when those German officers laughed in 1939, they weren't just laughing at a machine. They were laughing at an entire culture of innovation that they fundamentally misunderstood. They believed in the rigid top-down order. We, at our best, believed in the power of a good idea, no matter where it came from. This technology, this pre-cavity tech, has a legacy that is still with us every single day. The SCR-268 and 270 were clumsy, but they were the ancestors. The work done at the MIT Rad Lab didn't just win the war, it gave birth to the entire modern electronics industry. The lessons learned in microwave physics, in signal processing, in building reliable components, That's the foundation of your GPS. It's the foundation of weather forecasting. It's in a very real way the foundation of the microwave oven in your kitchen.
The German scientists were brilliant. Let's make no mistake. Their jets, their V-2 rockets, they were achievements of genius. But their system was flawed. Their leadership was consumed by hubris, and that hubris led them to a fatal conclusion that because they were ahead, they would stay ahead. The story of the Nazis scoffing at our early radar is the perfect parable for that. It's the story of the hare and the tortoise. Germany was the hare, fast, sleek, and far in the lead. They were so far ahead that they felt they could stop, take a nap, and mock the American tortoise lumbering behind with its heavy, clumsy SCR-268 on its back. But they didn't realize the tortoise had been given a secret injection, the cavity magnetron. And they didn't realize the tortoise had the manufacturing might of the entire North American continent behind it, ready to build 10,000 more. By the time the hare woke up, the tortoise was not just at the finish line. It had built a new automated finish line and was already planning the next race. The Arrogance was a strategic failure. It was an intelligence failure of the highest order. And it's why, when you look at the graphs of shipping losses in the Atlantic, the line doesn't just go down in 1943, it falls off a cliff. It's the most dramatic before and after picture in modern warfare. Before, the Allies were losing. After, the Germans were, as Donat said, rendered ineffective. This single technological pivot, born from that British-American partnership, made everything else possible. It's what allowed the ships to cross the Atlantic. It's what allowed the men to land at Normandy. It's what allowed the bombers to break the back of German industry. And it all started, in a way, because the enemy looked at our best attempt and they laughed. It's a powerful lesson. A nation or a person who is willing to look at their own clumsy toy, admit its flaws, and still believe in the idea, that is a hard person to beat. A person who believes they are already perfect, who believes they have all the answers, they have already lost. This story is one we are genuinely honored to share, and it's one that deserves to be remembered. If you found this history as fascinating as we do, the best way you can support this channel is simply by sharing this video. Send it to a friend, or post it in a history group, or just mention it to someone who you think would appreciate this kind of deep dive. It's how these stories stay alive. So, as we close this file, what is the final takeaway? It's not just that radar won the war, it's how it won the war. It was won in the quiet labs long before the first shot was fired. It was won by the Tizard Mission, a desperate gamble. And it was won, perhaps most of all, in that 1939 demonstration, when the Nazis showed their hand not with their technology, but with their laughter. They revealed their weakness, which was not metal or circuits, but arrogance. The SCR-268, that pre-cavity relic, wasn't a great radar, but it turned out to be the perfect test, a test of vision, a test of humility. The Germans failed that test, and in doing so, they sealed their own fate. We covered a lot of technical ground today, from the SCR-268 to the H2S and the Metox receiver. We know that can be a lot. If you want a simpler, shorter breakdown of just the cavity magnetron itself, we've linked a separate video about that miracle device in the description below. We'll be back next week with another story from the archives, another piece of history that shaped the world we live in. If you'd like to be notified when that new file is ready, you can click that bell icon next to the subscribe button. Thank you as always for your time and for your attention. It's difficult to overstate the importance of this moment. The entire war, particularly the war in Europe, was a race against time. If the Nazis had been able to delay the D-Day landings by even 6 months, two things would have happened. First, their V-2 rockets, which were already terrorizing London, would have been produced in greater numbers. And second, their Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, would have entered service in force.
A sky full of German jets would have made the Allied bombing campaign and any invasion a nightmare.
Their failure to appreciate our radar development, a failure that began with that Scoff in 1939, directly prevented them from buying that precious time. Their arrogance in 1939 led to their panic in 1943. When Admiral Dönitz realized his U-boats were being hunted by a technology he couldn't detect, he sent frantic messages back to Berlin. He demanded answers. German scientists scrambled. They captured a downed H-2S set. They were astonished. They called it the Rotterdam Gerät, or the Rotterdam device. They finally understood. The cavity magnetron. But it was too late to retool their factories, to design and build their own, and then, more importantly, to design and build detectors for it. That would take years. Years they did not have. Years they had wasted because they were so sure of their own superiority. They had been so impressed with their Würzburg radar that they couldn't imagine anything better. The story of the SCR-268 is a footnote in most history books. It's overshadowed by its younger, brilliant brother, the cavity magnetron. But its real importance wasn't as a weapon, it was as a mirror. It reflected back the arrogance of the observer. The Germans looked into it and saw a joke. The Americans looked into it, saw its flaws, and saw a promise. That promise was kept. It was kept in the frantic, sleepless nights at the MIT Rad Lab. It was kept in the cold bellies of the Liberator planes hunting in the dark. And it was kept by the merchant sailors who, by the middle of 1943, could finally make the crossing to Britain with a newfound sense of safety. The technology we use today, the GPS that guides your car, the weather report you check in the morning, the very phone or computer you're watching this on, all of it has roots in that desperate race. It's a reminder that sometimes the most useless or clumsy idea, in the right hands, can change the fate of the world. It just needs someone to believe in it, to fight for it, and to have the humility to see that good enough is never good enough when the stakes are this high. The gap between that pre-cavity technology and the magnetron was a chasm. It was a leap from the horse and buggy to the automobile, all in the span of about 24 months. The Germans, by scoffing, had essentially decided to stick with breeding better horses, while the Allies were secretly building the first engine. Let's think about that 1939 tour one last time. Those German officers, they were professionals. They were educated, experienced men. They were not fools, but they were trapped in a system that rewarded certainty and punished doubt. To go back to Berlin and say, the Americans have a clumsy radar, but I am worried about their potential, might have been a career-ending move. It was safer to report what his superiors wanted to hear. We are superior, they are no threat. This is a human failing. We see it time and time again. We see it in business, in politics, and in our own lives. The comfort of believing you are already on the winning team. The fear of being the one to sound the alarm, to be the naysayer. The German officers chose comfort, and in doing so, they provided the Allies with the one weapon more powerful than any radar: time. Time to work in secret, time to fail and fail and fail again, until, finally, they succeeded. The story of the SCR-268 and its pre-cavity cousins is, in the end, a story of perception. The Nazis saw a thing. The Allies saw a concept. The thing was weak. The concept was unstoppable. And when they laughed, they weren't laughing at a piece of American machinery. They were laughing at a way of thinking. And in the long, brutal years that followed, that way of thinking would prove to be their undoing. The sheer scale of the American effort that followed is almost impossible to comprehend. The MIT Rad Lab grew from a handful of academics to over 4,000 people. They developed over 100 different radar systems.
The U.S. government spent over $3 billion on radar development alone. That's over $50 billion in today's money. All of this was hidden, a secret world operating just beneath the surface of the public war effort. And the Germans? They were left chasing ghosts. They were trying to figure out why their U-boats were vanishing. They were trying to understand how bombers could find their cities through clouds. They were reacting to a war that was already 2 steps ahead of them. That initial moment of hubris in 1939 had blinded them, and they spent the rest of the war trying to catch up in a race they didn't even know they were in until it was far too late. It's a chilling thought. A single laugh, a dismissive report, a failure of imagination, and the course of history is altered. The pre-cavity tech was the pivot point. It was the fork in the road. The Germans took the path of arrogance, and the Allies, out of sheer desperation, took the path of innovation. The rest, as we know, is history. This story also highlights the incredible unsung heroism of the Tizard Mission, those scientists who crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a passenger ship, unescorted, knowing that German U-boats were hunting in those very waters. They carried in their heads and in that black box the secrets that could save their nation, knowing that if they were captured, the war would be lost. It was a gamble of almost unimaginable proportions.
When they arrived, they weren't met with a parade. They were met with skepticism. The American military, much like the Germans, was compartmentalized. The Navy didn't talk to the Army. The Signal Corps didn't trust the new civilian scientists. But Vannevar Bush and the leaders at MIT understood. They saw what Tizard was offering. They saw the Magnetron, and they knew, in that instant, that the game had changed. They effectively built a secret parallel government of science. The Rad Lab became a place where British and American minds worked as one. This fusion, this trust, was our real secret weapon. The Germans, with their internal rivalries, Goering's Luftwaffe fighting with Donitz's Navy for resources, the SS running its own secret projects, could never achieve that level of unity. So, the next time you hear about the miracle of radar, remember, it wasn't just one miracle. It was 2. The first was the technology itself, the cavity magnetron. But the second, and perhaps the more important, was the human one. It was the humility of the British to share their greatest secret, and the wisdom of the Americans to accept it and pour their industrial might into it. And it was all set against the backdrop of an enemy who was too proud, too arrogant, and too certain of their own superiority to even see the threat until it was screaming down at them from a dark sky lit by a sudden, blinding light. The laugh in 1939 was the beginning of the end. Let's bring this back to the machine at the center of that fateful 1939 meeting, the SCR-268. What became of it? Well, it was quickly overshadowed by the new microwave sets. But it wasn't useless. It served, along with its brother, the SCR-270, in the early days of the war. They were shipped to the Panama Canal, to the Philippines, and, as we know, to Hawaii. They were the eyes of the Army before the real eyes were ready. They were, in effect, the placeholder, the stopgap. And in their role as a stopgap, they performed one last crucial service. They served as a decoy. The Germans, having seen the 268, thought they knew what American radar was. Their entire intelligence network was looking for that kind of technology, for big, clumsy, low-frequency antennas. They weren't looking for small 10-centimeter dishes. It was the perfect misdirection, made all the more perfect because it was completely unintentional. We were, in essence, saved by our own initial mediocrity. Our first attempt was so uninspiring that the enemy wrote us off completely. It's a fantastic, ironic twist of history. The very thing that should have been our greatest weakness, our clumsy toy, became our greatest piece of camouflage. It allowed the real work to happen in secret. It allowed the Rad Lab to build the weapons of victory unmolested by spies or sabotage because the enemy was looking in all the wrong places. They were preparing to fight the last war's technology while America and Britain were busy inventing the next one. The arrogance of the Nazi regime is a well-documented part of that history. We see it in their grand architectural plans, their master race ideology. But it's in these small technical moments, a scoff in a demonstration, a dismissive report, that you see how that arrogance wasn't just philosophy. It was a crippling, practical disability. It made them deaf, and it made them blind at the very moment their survival depended on being able to see and hear what was coming next. This is a story that has fascinated us for years. The human element of warfare is so often where the real battles are won and lost, not on the field, but in the minds of the commanders, in the labs of the scientists, and in the fatal assumptions that are made when no one is looking. It's a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is often not the one across the ocean, but the one in the mirror. The one that tells you you're already smart enough, that you're already strong enough, and that you have nothing left to learn. Thank you for joining us for this story. It's a complex one, full of technical details and human drama, and we appreciate you spending this time with us to truly understand it. The men who built these devices and the men who flew those dark, lonely patrols over the Atlantic were part of a generation that faced unimaginable challenges. And in this story, we see a glimpse of how, against all odds, they won. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the SCR-268 to the H-2S. If you want a simpler breakdown, we've linked a shorter video about just the cavity magnetron in the description below. We'll be back next week with another story from the archives. Click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when it's ready. Thank you for your time. The legacy of this pre-cavity era is a fascinating one. The SCR-268 and 270 were by 1945 ancient history. They were replaced so completely and so quickly that they are barely remembered. But the people they trained, the very first generation of radar operators and technicians, became the foundation for the entire U.S. electronics warfare community. The men who cut their teeth on those clumsy toys were the ones who taught the next generation how to use the new, powerful microwave sets. They were the pioneers, the ones who had to figure out what those strange blips on the screen even meant. They were the ones who had to convince skeptical officers that the ghosts they were seeing were in fact real targets. It was this human element, the training and the trust, that was just as vital as the hardware. The Germans never developed this culture. Because their leadership was arrogant, their radar operators were often treated as secondary. The real heroes were the fighter pilots, the U-boat captains. This meant that even when German radar was good, the information it provided was often ignored or mistrusted by a high command that still believed in instinct and will over data. So, when we look back at that 1939 demonstration, we see two futures branching off. One, the German future, was based on perfecting what they already knew. The other, the Allied future, was based on discovering what they didn't know. That, in the end, was the entire war in a nutshell. The Scoff was more than just a laugh. It was a choice to stop learning. And from that moment, the clock began to tick. The greatest industrial and scientific mobilization in human history was about to begin, all of it in secret, all of it shielded by the enemy's own comfortable, fatal sense of superiority. It's one of history's greatest and most bitter ironies.
The story doesn't just end with the U-boats. The arrogance permeated every aspect of their war. In the deserts of North Africa, Rommel's tanks were initially dominant, but Allied forces, using new radar-directed artillery and air support, began to turn the tide. The Germans, still reliant on visual sighting, were baffled. In the skies over Germany, their Me-262 jets were a marvel, but they were deployed too late, in numbers too small, and without the sophisticated airborne radar that would have allowed them to hunt bombers effectively at night. Every step of the way, they were hobbled by their 1940 mindset. They were fighting a 1944 war with 1940 assumptions, and the Allies, having been forced to innovate or die, were now setting the pace. The pre-cavity tech, that humble SCR-268, had served its purpose. It had been the useful failure that spurred a revolution. It's a lesson that is, frankly, timeless.
In any competition, whether it's a war or a business or just a personal goal, the moment you believe you are superior is the moment you begin to lose. The moment you scoff at your competition is the moment you have given them their greatest advantage. You've given them the gift of your own blindness. The Nazis were brilliant engineers, but poor students of human nature and even poorer students of history. They forgot that America, when unified and focused, becomes an industrial force unlike anything the world has ever seen. They judged the sleeping giant by its groggy, half-awake state and never once considered what would happen if it were to be fully roused. The SCR-268 was that groggy, clumsy attempt. The cavity magnetron, the B-29, and the atomic bomb, that was the giant fully awake. And it all happened in the blink of an eye. This is the kind of history that truly matters. It's not just about what happened, but why it happened. The human decisions, the fatal flaws, the moments of genius, and the strokes of luck. The story of the radar war is all of those things wrapped into one, and it all hinges on that one simple human reaction, a scoff, when they should have been taking notes. Thank you for staying with us through this extended analysis. We know this was a long and detailed journey, and your attention is what allows us to tell these stories in the depth they deserve. We look forward to seeing you again for the next file from the archive.